Now's a good time to grab it. We're going to do a short networking exercise, and then we're going to get started. And once we get started, we won't have a break, so you should grab whatever refreshments you think you're going to want now. Thank you, that's very nice.
Hey guys. Alright, so we're just going to get kick started really quick.
Say hi.
Hey guys, we're going to get started. Sorry, getting out of the house. Give me a few minutes. Alright, so thank you for everybody for driving out. So I wanted to see who had the longest drive today. Anybody want to offer where they drove from?
Long Beach?
Okay, that's kind of far. You?
Claremont.
Okay, so Claremont, that's pretty far. Okay, maybe you win. But I think we have somebody from Chino and Azusa as well. So you guys, thank you.
Chino beats Claremont. Chino?
Chino's pretty far. That's like almost Orange County. You know, Chino Hills.
Oh, no, I'm
yeah.
thinking Chico?
Chico? No.
That's the one up north? Chico.
Yeah. All right, guys, thank you. And wanted to do, how many of you are here at our first LAUX meetup, like their first meetup with LAUX? So a lot of you guys. Okay, cool. Well, thanks for joining us. So we're going to do just a quick 3-minute icebreaker. So maybe like if you guys can form groups of 3, like the 3 people that you haven't talked to or you can talk to a little bit. And then the 2 questions you're going to ask is what cities have you guys lived in? Like if you're from out of LA. How many of you guys have been out of LA for a while? Okay, so we're very circle. And then what would you like to get out of today? All right, so I'm going to set a timer for 3 minutes. And then Susan's going to take over and introduce our awesome speaker for the evening, Sela. So thank you for joining us. So 3 minutes. Okay, and then Susan, you can please take over after that. Hello. All right, please. I think we're good. All right, guys, please give Susan your attention.
Hi, everyone. So, actually, I don't remember. Thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate everybody being here. I just want to get a sense for what brought you out. How many people are actually game designers here? Wow. How many people are gamers? Okay, a few more. So how many people just came out because they were interested in psychology of UX and how to apply that to whatever products you're working on? And that's why I'm here. That's why I'm really interested in Celia's work. I'm not a game designer. I consider myself an experienced designer. And I read her book about a year ago, and I'm not a gamer, so I'm glad I picked it up and I didn't let that stop me, like, oh, this book is just about gaming, because it's really not. It's much more broad than that, and I think that the information that she has of how she creates games is really useful for any product that you're creating, and that's what she's going to talk about tonight. And I also have to say I have 2 young boys, 11 and 12, and the fact that she was the director of UX on Fortnite, it's like, I know she knows something about creating engagement, because if you know anybody, I know there's a lot of maybe people in here, if your gamers are playing it also, but I know for the younger kids it's like super popular. So I'm really excited to welcome Celia Hodit.
So much, Susan. I'm really happy to be here with you today. I've been, like Susan said, I have my background in psychology, so I have a PhD in psychology that I had in France. I'm French originally, hence the accent, but I've been working in the video game industry in the past 10 years. Worked at Ubisoft. I started there, so in France, and then I moved to Ubisoft Montreal. Then I worked at LAUX. I was working on Star Wars games up until the time there Disney bought Lucas, killed LucasArts. So this is when I moved to Epic in 2013. And I became director of UX at Epic, so at the studio level. So I worked on different products, not just Fortnite. But Fortnite was one of the most interesting projects I worked on, and that was pretty cool. And I left Epic in late 2017 to become a consultant. And now I live here, like in LA area, and I do that a lot. So I do training sessions, do speaking, talking around the world about this stuff, and talking about the brain and video games, 2 of my favorite things. So this is what I'm going to do today. If at any point in time, I know some of you have to leave before the end, there's a bunch of resources on my website. You find not necessarily this presentation per se, but I am writing currently some blog posts that's going to be on my website at some point. I have a blog post called The UX of Fortnite. It's going to be up soon. I was going to talk about a lot of what we're going to see today, and I'm pretty active on Twitter, so if you wanted to ask me a question that I had to leave, feel free to ping me on Twitter. Alright, so we're going to start. We're going to talk a little bit about UX applied to games, but how many of you have a good understanding of cognitive science? Okay, so we're going to start talking about this. Oh yeah, I had slides to Ubisoft, Fortnite. Okay, so in the video game industry, UX was not a thing until very recently. We had that mentality that we're just going to do the games that we want to do, and we ship it, and then whatever happens, happens. And not so long ago, we started to see a shift in our industry, and this is a real achievement that I unlocked in a real game. Really, I sucked at that game. I died a lot, and then I unlocked this. And it was pretty funny to me because it was one of the first times that it was acknowledged that if I the target audience for that specific game, could not make it, and it was too hard for me, probably it's not my fault, it's probably the fault of the game itself. So it was one of the first times that really UX started to be acknowledged and as being a thing that was important to apply to games. But it took a while to get there, and so I'm going to show you a little bit how we apply this in the game industry, in an industry that it's pretty immature industry in the sense that it's a very new industry. So there's not a lot of processes, and they don't necessarily know a lot about usability and emotional design, all the work from Donald Norman, all that. It's pretty new in this industry. So one of the first things I have to do when I talk to teams or when I start in a new company is to explain a little bit the science behind it so that people start to understand better why they need psychologists, because a lot of them have been making games for a while and they're like, why do I need a psychologist all of a sudden to do my job? So I try to explain what's behind it and why it can be interesting to do that. So I explained to them that experiencing a game happens in the player's mind. We can't design an experience, and experience is something that's going to be lived through someone's mind. So we can design an environment hoping that the person is going to have the experience that we want. But to do that, we need to anticipate what's going to be that experience. And since it's going through people's minds, we need to understand how the brain works. And playing a game is mostly a learning experience because you have to learn about the game mechanics, you have to learn about the controls, about the objectives, the systems, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of things you need to learn. So one of the first things I try to explain to the teams is how the brain learns and how the brain processes information. So this is like a very simplified, overly simplified version of what's going on in the brain when you learn something. So it always starts with perception. You don't learn from the void. You learn from an input. It starts by an input, and so it starts by perception. Then there's going to be a bunch of things happening. You process the information, and if you learn about something new, what's going to happen is physically it's changing something in your brain. It's changing your synaptic connections. So the synapses are connections between neurons, and it's physically changing these connections in your brain. So when you have people like freaking out about video games, it's rewiring my kids' brains, they're actually right to say this. It is rewiring your brain, your kids' brains as well, but so is everything you do in life. Because the brain is not hardwired in the first place, it's very malleable. We have what we call brain plasticity. Thanks to that, we learn and we adjust and we adapt to our environment. So it's a pretty important thing to be having. But so if you play a video game, if you watch a movie, if you read a book, if you chat with friends, watching a presentation like today about the brain is going to rewire your brain, and it's nothing to be afraid of. But of course in this process between an input and memorizing things and learning about that, there's a lot of things happening, and there's a lot of factors going to influence the quality of the learning. You have biological factors, you have physiological factors. At the end of the day, it's usually harder to get information in and remember all that information because you're getting tired, especially since you just ate, so now you're digesting, so helping. But the factor that we're going to talk today mostly is attention. I'm going to touch on a little bit on motivation and emotion a bit later, but in the first part I'm going to talk about attention. Attention and resources has a huge impact on the quality of learning. So please keep in mind that's a very, very simplified version of what's going on in the brain. We don't have independent buckets like these. We don't necessarily have a serial process, and it's not even a process because we use a lot of terms coming from computer because it's an analogy that's it's a metaphor that's pretty good to help us understand how the brain works. But the brain is very, very complex and does not work like a computer. So with that caveat in mind, disclaimer in mind, I'm going to take an example for each perception, memory, and attention. I'm going to tell you about the main limitation of our brains in terms of perception, memory, and attention, and give you one example of how we go beyond this limitation in games. Taking the example of Fortnite. So for perception, take a look at this input, and with the colors changing. Can you tell me what you perceive in this picture?
DNA sequence.
What's that?
It looks like a DNA sequence.
DNA sequence, okay. Anything else? And the colors are not.
The top ones are.
Yeah, I heard it. So I heard Street Fighter characters. So how many of you are now perceiving Street Fighter characters in this picture? Okay, now you see it.
Street Fighter.
Okay, so
Oh my
man. So Street Fighter is a very popular combat game. And of course, because the lighting is a bit different here, you don't see the colors as well. But I show that image usually to a crowd, to an audience of game developers, and so all of them, have a very strong knowledge on games, that have a strong games culture. And yet, when I show this, I have about 40% of the rooms like Street Fighter characters, and the whole like super excited, and the rest, so 60% is like, well, I don't know, like people, DNA, people are not sure. And if you're colorblind, like about 8% of the male population, you hate me right now because you're out, you're left out, you can't participate into this game, which is a way for me to remind everybody that you can't convey information through colors only. So perception is subjective. It is a construct of the mind. We don't perceive the reality as it is. Depending on your knowledge on the world, you're going to perceive something differently. We perceive differently depending on our expectations, our prior knowledge, context, many things. And this is hard for us to keep that in mind. We have a tendency to think, especially with vision, because so it seems so obvious, and there's a huge part of the brain dedicated to vision. We have a tendency to believe that everybody's seeing the same things, but we are not. And so, depending on your culture, many things, we're not all going to perceive one input in the same way. And that's a big problem because in video games, such as like many products that we develop, it's just a series of inputs that people need to perceive accordingly in the way intended. So what do you do? Because as a designer, you're going to design some icons or character design or environment in such a way that you think that's obvious to you, but you're not sure that your audience is actually going to perceive it in the same way. So that's the reason why we test. And I'm going to show you an example of how we test it. So in Fortnite, when I started 2013, we had, so for those who don't know Fortnite, it's a game where you shoot zombies and you build and you craft things. So we had this icon back then. Can you guess what is this representing?
It looks like a trap.
Yeah, but you know this, you've been there before.
But I don't remember this.
Really? That's interesting. We're going to talk about memory later. So, any other ideas what this can be representing?
I mean, my guess would be a forest.
A forest? Yep.
Could also be bullets.
Bullet. Okay.
Building.
Building.
Because I know a little bit about the game.
Could be inside Jaws.
Yeah, Jaws, okay. So this is indeed, so even
I played Fortnite, so that's why this reminds me of traps.
so it's indeed the icon for traps. And what we did, so that, of course that's a placeholder, so prototype of the main menu in Fortnite. And we brought people over because the core gameplay was already there. And some players played the game for 20 minutes, and then we showed them some icons and things, and what is this, and what is that, so we can verify their perception of it is matching our intention. And for this specific icon, we did not have everybody recognizing the icon for traps, even though they played around with this. Some people said trees, other people said ammunition, because if you look at the icon for ammunition, it's actually very close to the one for traps. So it's a big problem, because in Fortnite, traps is quite important. You need to play around with traps if you want to win. So that's not one of the main features in the game. So you really don't want to have any confusion with the icon representing that thing, and you want it to be as intuitive as possible, because the most intuitive it is, the less people have to learn about it and have to remember it. So if there's any doubt, we might want to iterate on it. So this is what we did. And we changed it into a stereotypical representation of a trap, a bear trap. There is no bear trap whatsoever in Fortnite, but as soon as we started to use this icon, then we didn't see any confusion anymore. And these were the people who we tested in the West. So again, the icon's going to you might use a symbol that is totally meaningful for a population or a culture, but if you ship your game in the East, maybe it's not gonna mean the same thing. So there's a whole lot of things around culturalization and you need to take into account, etc. Or with kids, if you use because I'm older, to me the floppy disk is meaningful to express saving, but for kids, it's really not meaningful, so they have to learn that. So again, perception is subjective and it depends on many things. All right, now we're going to talk about memory. I'm going to ask you to, I hope you all know the sculpture, The Thinker from Auguste Rodin. All right, so try to remember this sculpture and try to picture it in your mind and tell me, can you remember on which leg or legs lay which arm or arms of the thinker? So I spot a few people doing the gesture to try to remember it. So you were saying right on right?
I'd say right on the left leg.
Right on left, like this? Okay.
I feel like it was same on same.
Yeah. I also left on left.
Left on left, right on right. Okay. Any other answers?
Right on left.
Oh.
All right. That was the missing one we didn't say. So let's take a look. He actually has he has both arms on the left. So of course it was a trick question. That's not funny. But why am I showing you this? Even if that sculpture is pretty iconic, at least in our cultures, it's really hard to remember it perfectly. You remember overall the position or how it looks like, but you can't remember it precisely. Maybe you did not even see that sculpture in 3D in real life. You might have just seen a 2D representation of it. There's one in I think he's filming, right? And memory is pretty fallible. So if you have a very shallow encoding process of something, it's very likely that you're gonna lose a lot of details. If you're an artist and you copied that sculpture yourself, you are way more likely to have a deeper process on it, and so you're gonna remember it much more accurately. But most of us don't do that, so we don't have a perfect, it's not as if we're taking pictures and then storing stuff and then when you have to remember, you just pick it up. It's not the way it works. So memory is pretty fallible, and on top of this, we forget a bunch of stuff. This is the forgetting curve that was made by Emil Gauss in the 19th century. He tested himself, but this was replicated, of course, later on. It's showing the exponential nature of forgetting. So he taught himself some non-meaningful syllables, so he did not have any familiarity with the content. And then he varied the moment after he learned them by heart when he had to recall this content. Immediately after he learned them by heart, he has 100% good answers. After only 9-10 minutes, drops down to 60%. After a day, it's dropping nearly to 30%. So that's your worst case scenario. When you're learning about something that doesn't have any meaning, any sense, that you do not care about, with no methodology of any kind, you're going to roughly lose about 70% from of the content that you learned from one day to the next. So hopefully tomorrow we remember more than 30% of what we're seeing tonight. But we are trying to, smooth that curve because, again, when you play video games, usually it's an experience that you have over time. So if players come back the next day and they forgot a bunch of stuff, it's not good because then they don't know how to play anymore. So that's the reason why. Because memory is fallible, not only we forget a bunch of stuff and for what we remember, it's actually not super accurate, we need to alleviate the memory load. And that's the whole point of having a HUD, so the heads-up display, all the information that's in the corners, that's here so that players do not have to remember this information. Or whenever you, in Fortnite, whenever you get close to a searchable object, we're going to pop up in the UI what key you need to press. We do not ask players to have to remember this. So we give that information away, so it's alleviating the memory load. So when they come back, we're not under the forgetting curve because the most important information is always here. Some designers might think that you need to remove as much stuff as possible on the HUD to have a better immersive experience. But that's a fallacy. You can only do that if your game is very simple, because the more you remove, the more you're relying on the memory, and at some point players are going to forget what they need to do, what button to press, so they're going to have to pause the game to figure it out, and that for sure is going to break their immersion. So the HUD is all about finding the right balance, because you don't want to put too much information on there, because then you have information overload, so you have to find the right balance, which is the difficult part, of course. Another example, if players want to craft a specific item, like the exterminator, we offer them a way to pin the recipe on their HUD. So they do not have to remember what are the different ingredients and what's missing, what they need to go get, so that they can focus on their objectives and not having to remember a bunch of stuff that we don't really care about. So alleviating and reducing the memory load is going to be very important. Okay, so one last thing. I'm going to show you some cards, and it's going to go pretty fast. I'm going to ask you to pick one of these cards and to remember this card. Ready? Pick one and remember it. I bet I can guess which card you picked and make it disappear.
Oh, wow.
So I've changed all the cards. Are you impressed with my magic trick? So sorry, it's a bit lousy. I'm not a magician, okay? But in psychology, this is what we call change blindness. We don't have a lot of attentional resources, and so when we're asked to do something, to focus on one thing, to remember one thing, we're just going to look at that thing, and so I can, remove everything else and change everything else, and most of the time you're not even going to see whatever happened because you can't process everything and remember everything. This is not how it works. In magic, this has a name. Magicians call that misdirection of attention. So we don't have a lot of good attentional resources, and so attention is pretty scarce. But the problem is that we believe that we process everything and we can analyze everything, and we believe that we can multitask and we can handle many things at the same time. That's not true. And the problem is that we are blind to our blindness, and that's a problem because we're not aware of our limitations. So attention is scarce. That's a big problem because in a lot of games, especially action games, we are challenging attention, which is fine, except when we are trying to convey specific things to players because they have to learn about the mechanics and all that. So there are moments when we give tutorials. We onboard players. We teach them how they how to use how the game is played. And when that happens, we need to make sure that we're not placing them in a multitasking situation because they're not going to be able to pay attention to the important information we're conveying. And here's an example. It did not work well when we were developing Fortnite. We were testing very early on we were testing how we were about to teach a lot of different mechanics. One of the mechanics we are teaching is regen health. So in lots of games like Fortnite, you have a health bar, like this one, and at some point where it's too low, you're risking to die, and so to avoid that, you can consume a health item. So back then in Fortnite, you had to consume a health item to regen your health. Today is not the case anymore. You use traps to regen health. But anyway, so how are we gonna explain to players how this works? Usually you want to wait until it's meaningful to players to learn about this. So you're not gonna explain to them how to regen their health and they have full health. So we try to wait at very good moments where they really care about it. And so the programmers thought, all right, we're gonna wait until It's the first time they go below 50% with their health bar, we're going to tell them how to regain their health. So it looks like this. This is taken from a playtest session that we had at Epic. There's no sound, that's not too bad. So it's going below 50, so this is pulsing, and you have a gameplay tip. You can consume a health item to make yourself feel better. And it's disappearing. And of course, because players were in combat at the moment that this is happening, most of them did not even perceive that anything was changing in the HUD. So we cannot pay attention to tutorial tests or text when we are busy doing something else. Multitasking is a myth. We are not good at it. We pretend we're good at it, but we don't realize the information we're missing when we're trying to multitask. And the women are no better at it. So this is something that we have to keep in mind. And all what I'm telling you is going to be depending on, in a game, contrary to other products, when we think about UX. And all other products, we try to remove all the frictions, all the frustrations. In games, you actually have frustrations and frictions that are by design. That's the main difference between a game and other products. Because we are challenging players in some places. So in action games, you are challenging players in attention, but you don't want to challenge them in attention when they're learning. You have games that are challenging people in perception. I don't know if you played a game called Monument Valley. It's a game about perception. That's based on the universe from MC Escher, and it's all about perception. I have games challenging memory, etc., etc. So depending on the type of game you're making, you sometimes want to build the challenge somewhere, but you want it there if it's by design. If it's not by design, you want to remove that friction. So this is like the basic information we need to keep in mind. We have brain limitations, and people experiencing our products, including video games, they experience them through their minds. The experience happens in their minds. So we need to keep in mind that perception is subjective, attention is first, and memory is followed. And all the pillars in UX that I'm going to talk about, the ingredients that I'm going to talk about, are based off of that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the framework I've been using around game UX. Again, keep in mind that this is very new, and you have, so that's the framework I've been developing in the past 10 plus years. It's not perfect, it's going to evolve, I'm pretty sure. I didn't have any framework to work with, so I had to make up one. So to think about game user experience, there are two main pillars that I focused on. The one is common to any product that you develop, usability. We understand that. You have to make sure that your product can be used by your audience, so that's really, really important. Now in games, we have that other thing. A game has to be fun. Contrary to a tool or whatever, people are not playing a game. It's not a means to an end. It's an autotelic activity. You play a game for the pleasure of playing it. So Don Norman talks about emotional design. It's certainly very important for any product. But for games, if there's no engagement in anything, if you don't have any fun, you're not playing, even if the game is super usable. So there's that missing thing that we don't really have a very strong framework for that. And some people call that fun, other people call that immersion, other people, I used to call that game flow for a while, but it was not really truly encompassing everything that you need to be engaging and fun. So that's the reason why I made up that because it's the ability for the game to be engaging. So this is what I call it right now. It's not perfect, I don't know if I'm super happy about it, but it's the best I could do so far. So for usability, I'm going to go very quickly because most of you should know about usability since we're all in UX. So I'm going to take a bit more time to talk about engageability. So for usability, so most of this, so this is what I'm using, and this is it's not really the heuristic that I'm using myself to assess a game. It's more about how I'm communicating with the whole team. So it's not necessarily about covering all the grounds with this. It's more to have the main guidelines so that the team can make sure they not forget about something important. And I reuse, it's heavily inspired, of course, from Jacob Nielsen's 10 Euro 6. But Jacob Nielsen uses a lot of terms that it's not used in the video game industry because already for them it's hard to get into UX, blah, blah, blah. I try to UX the UX of it. So I made it more usable for them. And instead of visibility of system status, I use the term signs and feedback because this is a term that they use. So we need to make sure that you have all the signs and feedback for the actions that you can do in the game. These signs and feedback need to be clear. Form follows function is a term that we use more in the video game industry. It's affordance, basically, but we talk more about form follows function, which is a term coming for architecture. And in video games, we have a role called level designer. It's actually the architect of the game. In fact, that's the person who's designing the levels. Then consistency, minimum workload, error prevention, recovery, flexibility. So it's things that we are pretty aware of. Of course, manual, access to documentation. In games, you can have that. Sometimes you have a bestiary or you have like a list of all the things that you learn. That can happen, but it's really not central to games, so it's not in there. So an example of form follows function, because we talked about icons and a lot of people stay focused on the UI, UX, that's confusing everybody, but UX is about everything, so the whole experience a player is going to have with the game. And that includes character design, for example. In Mario, the character design for enemies is very well polished, and they have a very good form follows function. Like if you look at that enemy, you can see that that enemy is tied to the ground. So you understand it's not going to run after you, and that enemy is going to be dangerous to you in this area. Now the turtles, you understand that if you jump on them, it's probably not going to hurt them. This one, you understand, is going to go very fast in that direction. Unlikely that it's going to turn around to chase you in your other direction. This one, probably not a good idea to jump on it. This one is about to throw something at you, so it's probably going to hurt you from a distance. And Bowser, of course, has spikes on its back, so it's probably going to hurt you if you jump on it. This is form follows function to character design. So I usually talk about that because there's too much emphasis on UX/UI, where UX is the whole experience. UI is certainly a part of it, but it's not just that. So the environment, the character design, all that's going to have an impact. So we try to make it as intuitive as possible so that people don't have to learn too many things, and that we put the challenge where we want to put it. And Nintendo is very good at that, very good at making the trade-offs they need to make to offer the experience they want to offer. The other example I want to take into the list is flexibility, because again, the video game industry is very late into all the questions around accessibility, and a lot of people don't necessarily understand what it means to make a game accessible. People think, oh, you want to make games easy for everybody. It's like, no, making a game accessible is about flexibility, so offering many options so that players of all sorts and everybody can access the game and play it. So if you're interested into that, how we use accessibility in games, there's a very good website, gameaccessibilityguidelines.com, where we have a lot of these guidelines. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about engageability, which is actually the interesting part in games, but also the fuzziest part of it all, because we don't have a strong framework, and the science behind it is way more recent. So already in usability and perception, attention, memories, it's more complex than I showed you, but we have a fair understanding of it. The concept behind engagement is more complicated. So what's behind engagement? It's three main things. It's motivation, emotion, and game flow. Motivation is, of course, crucial in engagement. You're not going to engage people if they're not motivated. There is no behavior if there is no motivation. If you were not motivated to come over here this evening, you would have stayed home or stayed at work or go back home or whatever. Maybe you have better things to do than come over here. And so motivation is really crucial. If you're not motivated, you're not coming. And then emotion and game flow, these are, so I can talk about this in the Q&A. I'm not going to explain it because it takes too much time. But these are supporting motivation. Motivation is really at the core of engagement. So when we talk about motivation, there's two main concepts that we mostly talk about. It's extrinsic motivation and intrinsic motivation. There's more sorts of motivation for these two, but these are the two main that we are talking about when we talk about games. Extrinsic motivation is the motivation to do something because you want something else. So maybe you hate your job, but you're going every day to go to work because you need the paycheck so then you can pay for your rent or do fun things. Maybe you came over here because someone forced you or because you wanted to please someone. So that's extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic motivation is when you do something for the pleasure of doing it. So maybe you're here because you care about understanding better how it works and psychology and all that is fascinating to you. So you're not here, it's not a means to an end. These two sorts of motivation are really, really crucial in games. Extrinsic motivation, we understand that pretty well. In games, we know that we have objectives, and if we meet these objectives, we're going to get a reward. Games do that very well. So that's what we call extrinsic motivation. It's badges and leveling up and points and loots and all of that. So it's going to be very important in the game to make sure players can understand what they can do, what are the different objectives, and what they're going to get once they accomplish these objectives. That's quite important. If you accomplish a mission and you don't get anything, you're like, what the hell is that game? I want something. So we care about extrinsic motivation. But of course, that's not it. That's important, but that's not enough to motivate people or engage them. What you care about also is intrinsic motivation. You play games for the pleasure of playing them. So what is it in games, in certain games, that make you come back? So we have a lot of theories about motivation. The most reliable that we have so far for intrinsic motivation is called the self-determination theory, or SDT for short. This theory explains that we are more motivated to do certain activities when these activities are satisfying our needs for competence, autonomy, and relatedness. If you have a hard time remembering this, the first letters is forming the word car to drive you around your life. And it's cheesy, but it works. So competence is mainly about the sense of progression. You are not going to be motivated into learning something new. Let's say you want to learn how to play the guitar and you like a song in particular, you want to play that tune. And every day that you practice, getting better at it. So you see yourself progressing, that's super cool, or if it's sports, that's your thing, every day you're getting better at it. And if you see yourself progressing, that's motivating. If at some point you're not progressing, this is when you might quit. Because it's very frustrating to put a lot of effort into doing something and not perceiving any progress. And sometimes you are progressing, but you're not perceiving it. It happens to a lot of people. That's the reason why I'm using that example. If you're trying to lose weight and you're on a diet, it's hard because you are refraining from eating the stuff that you love to lose weight. And if, at the end of the week, every week, you can see that you're losing weight, it's motivating you to keep going. If at some point, it always happens at some point, you hit a plateau, this is when it's getting very, very hard to keep doing your diet because you're not seeing yourself progressing. This is when you're like, oh, fuck it, it's not doing anything, so let me have that piece of chocolate. So we need to feel competent when we do something. And competence is about sense of progression. In games, it could be either skill-based or not skill-based. You have games that are based out of skills, like sports games or some competitive shooter games. A game like FIFA games or a game like Rocket League. The more you play, it's about like shooting cars and soccer. And the more you play, the better you should get at it. So it's skill-based. So you need to practice to have the twitch skills to win the game. But many games are not skill-based. Role-playing games, RPGs, are typically not skill-based. You play the game and you get a level up, and every time you level up, you're going to be able to buy a new ability that artificially makes you more competent and more powerful within the system. So it's artificial. Now you have a new ability that makes you more powerful in the system. So RPGs are not skill-based, but you still have a sense of progression. And that's also the reason why we have progression bars everywhere. It's not just because we know that when we level up, we're going to have a treat. It's also because leveling up is satisfying intrinsically, because you're progressing. It's a feedback on the fact that you're progressing in the game. So that's why you have progression bars everywhere. Autonomy is self-expression mainly. We need to express ourselves, we need to feel unique in a way, so that's the reason why we love games when they're allowing to express ourselves. So cosmetics is a big thing. Some games are only monetizing on cosmetics, and they work, see Fortnite, because we care about expressing ourselves. We care to choose the type of the body type, our face, our clothing, dance moves. So that's really, really important. But it's not always about cosmetics. Sometimes it's about how you're going to solve a problem. You have a lot of games that we call sandbox games. These games are allowing you to solve a problem, to accomplish a mission in many different ways. There's no one way to solve it. Yeah, there are games you have to find the way of solving the problem, but games that allow for more autonomy are usually more satisfying. So a game like Minecraft allows for a lot of autonomy, because you can build whatever you want. You're free. You only have it's a sandbox game. So autonomy is going to be very, very important. It can be also autonomy in the choices that you make in the story. I don't know if you heard of a game called Detroit. It's a game where you choose what you want to do, and it's actually changing the story. And the last one, but not least, is relatedness. We are a very social species. We survived our predators not thanks to our big, powerful claws, but thanks to our cooperation, because we outsmarted our enemies thanks to that. And so any game where you can relate with others, either in cooperation or competition, are going to usually be more satisfying. Cooperation is actually more satisfying than competition. There's a lot of games focusing on competition because we believe that we love to compete, and some people love to compete. But even in competitive games, we often have a cooperation aspect to it. Many sports games are team-based, because you are cooperating within the team to compete against another team. And in video games, it's the same thing. So any game that allows you to compete with others, to cooperate, to build something together, is going to be usually more engaging, thanks to that. And so when you develop a game, you don't necessarily want to tick everything. It has to be meaningful with the game you're making. If you have a solo game, well, relatedness can maybe happen outside of the game. Look at Minecraft. The relatedness at the beginning of Minecraft happened on YouTube. So sometimes these things are not necessarily covered by the game itself, but within the ecosystem around the game. And it has to be meaningful. Like, you don't necessarily want to give autonomy and let players choose how they're going to look like in the game and spend 10-15 minutes into carefully choosing how the characters is going to look like. If you had a game in first-person camera, because then you're not seeing your character most of the time. So it has to make sense and be meaningful, and you have to see how everything is going to interact with one another in role-playing games. Often it's a game where you cooperate. You have a team of maybe 5 people, and you're gonna go into a dungeon and try to together cooperate to beat enemies. And in these games where you cooperate, you have different competences. You have the healer, you have the tank, who's the person who's gonna protect the team and take all the shield them, and you have the people who are gonna deal a lot of damage to the enemies. So you can choose your role, and also if you're confident that the healer is healing the person at the right moment, then you are confident in your role, and then people will say, "Oh, thank you so much," etc. So RPGs are usually coming more of this. So that's it, and emotions and flow is quite important as well, and how you teach players, how you onboard them is going to be critical, because onboarding is all about making your players competent into playing the game. So competence is one of the key elements of intrinsic motivation. So if your players are not competent to playing the game, if they die and they don't understand why, that for sure is going to make them want to rage quit. So onboarding is really, really important. You have to carefully choose what are the most important things you want to teach them at what time, because you can't teach them everything at the beginning. You have to distribute the learning over time. That's a huge work around how we're going to prioritize different learning in the game. And to teach players about these things, we try to place them in a situation where they can learn in context. So they can do it when we teach them how to do it. So it's learning by doing as opposed to reading about it and then do. Like in board games, you read the rules first and then you play. In video games, we try to make sure that you learn by playing. And it has also to be meaningful. So in Fortnite, in the story mode in the game, you learn the first time you learn how to build is because you're in a cave and you need to get out of the cave. To get out, you need to learn how to build stairs. So we try to place this player in a situation where there's an obstacle and they need to learn about a new mechanic to overcome that obstacle. So that's the intrinsic motivation, but also we place a chest here. That's the extrinsic motivation to get their reward once they're out. So that's it for game UX. So of course, I could talk. I had a master class that's covering all of that in 7 hours. So if you're interested, I'm doing one in LA. I'm not sure where exactly. It's going to be in the area, either in Culver City. Usually I do that around Culver City. I'm doing that on August 3rd, I think. It's on my website if you're interested to learn about that. And the last piece that I wanted to talk about is the scientific method. Because we have to verify, again, if all of our assumptions, we have a plan, we have a hypothesis, we're trying to offer a certain experience to a certain audience, and we need to verify if this is happening. And of course, like any project, when we make games, it can be like designed by committee, and everybody has opinions, and how do you know who's right? So we use the scientific method to make sure that we find the right problems to solve, and it's not the loudest person in the room that is gonna be right. And that's very important to not fall prey for our biases, because we have limitations, we have biases, we're humans, we're fallible, so we use scientific method to figure it out. So that's the reason why we do playtest sessions. So at Epic, I build up that playtest room so we can have players come in here, so you can see there's nothing exciting in there because we want to calm the hype. So people are like, oh, I'm at Epic Games, I'm super excited, but you're here for research. So we try to make it as neutral as possible. We know that it's going to have biases, and we make sure that they can't look at what the others are doing, and we can look at, we have overhead screens so we can see what they do, and we see their gameplay, and we have eye tracking so we can look at where they're looking at, and we can see their face and all that. And the team and the researchers usually are in the secret room with the one-way mirror, so we can watch without, the players, they know we're here, but because they don't see us, at some point they forget that we're here. And so it's allowing us to see what's going on without distracting them too much. So that's pretty cool. And so depending on what we're testing, we're gonna have specific hypotheses that we're gonna test. So whenever we need to have a UX pipeline, because doing tests, it's cool, but if you don't know what you're testing, it's not going to be as efficient. So before having the test, you set up your hypothesis. Where are we at in the development of the game? What can we test right now? What is ready? What is not ready? If you can't test, for example, if you don't have saving in the game, that usually happens a bit later, it's going to be hard to test how people understand their progression if you can't save all the things that you do in the game. So there are things that if you test later in the game, or you fake it to test it. But we have a hypothesis depending on where we are in the development, and we plan for the test. We have to make sure that the build, so the version of the game that we're going to use for the test, is stable enough, because when we develop a game, the build is very often not stable. That's also the reason why we're trying to do bigger tests as a milestone for the team when they already have to have a stable build, because otherwise it's just adding a lot of work for them to make the build stable, and sometimes they're just breaking everything. And depending on what we're testing, we have to make sure that there's no bugs that are affecting the systems that we're testing. Or if they are, is there a workaround? And then the day of the test, we need to make sure that people are available to come down to the lab and watch the test. So it's going to be important for the producer to make room and make sure that the team can watch the test. And then the UX team researchers are putting together a report explaining what they saw based on their analysis, what are the biggest problems, and we prioritize these issues depending, again, on what type of game we're doing, to what audience, and depending on the gravity of what we saw. And then we review that with the team, and sometimes the team is going to say, oh, you know what, this is by design. Okay, all right, that's weird, but fine. And sometimes the team's going to say, oh yeah, yes, we have a problem with that, but you know what, we're going to redo all that thing, all that system in a month. So put a pin on it. We're going to try to make sure once we redo it that we solve that problem as well, but we're not going to retest for that right now. And sometimes like, oh, yep, okay, we have a problem. So we try to identify where the problem is coming from and who's going to fix it. So we put, tasks to certain people, and then and we triage. The producers also adding, putting weight on the priorities that the UX researchers are setting, because producers can also say, wait, yes, but this is not as important as this one because this is really critical for the game. And so people are gonna have tasks. They have to fix some issues, and once they say it's fixed, the next test we verify if how the way they fixed the UX issues is actually really fixing the issue. And also we do, so I love to do that. I don't want to have upper management looking at the reports and be, oh my god, this is everything's broken, because they have a tendency to freak out. So I try to keep the trust of the team, because it's really important. Only show to the upper management that the one sheet, I'm like, this is the 5 biggest issues that we need to solve before we ship, for example. And I also, by the time I show them, the team has already figured out their plan. So here are the 5 issues that we're working on, and this is the plan of the team for how they're going to fix it. So this is what we do. It's going to be very important to have a pipeline. And then when you find a weakness, when something bad happens, and I'm going over as usual, we try to figure out why this is happening. Because as Donovan says, fixing issues, fixing problems is not the difficult part. It's fixing the right problems that's difficult. So in Fortnite, for example, at some point, we had players complaining that the game was grindy. So that's an expression that we use when you have to grind to get resources if you want to craft something. And the more you level up, the more materials you need to craft cool weapons. But at some point, players are feeling that it's too long to gather the material to craft cool things. So is this a problem in the design? You have system designers, that's their job, to design the systems and to define, that's basically math, how it's going to progress, how much material they're going to have to gather at what level so that it's still challenging but not too much, blah, blah, blah. So is it coming from the design? Is the math off? Or is it coming from their perception of it? Because again, remember that perception is subjective and it's different from reality. So sometimes your design is sound, but for some reason people perceive it in a different way. So in that case, the system designer verified the spreadsheet and was like, no, it looks solid, it's probably not coming from the design. So then we look into what people perceive it and how, is there something in the art and the interaction design, something that's actually making them feel that it's more grindy than it is in reality. So in the case of Fortnite, one of the things that we're looking into to find out why this is happening, is there something that makes them go slower than it should be going. In Fortnite, when you start destroying things, you have that little thing popping. That's the weak point. In the design, you're supposed to understand that, oh, this is the weak point of the object, and you have to aim at it, and if you hit it, then you harvest way faster. And the problem is that when we were testing Fortnite early on, this is what we were observing. So players were coming over, start destroying stuff, and we're not at all aiming at that weak point. So that's a problem because the whole system design is based off players hitting this weak point. So if they're not hitting it, of course it's going to take way longer for them to harvest this thing. And I was taking screenshots, and after a few minutes of play, I was asking players, what is this? And most of them were saying, I don't know. So I thought, okay, it's not standing out enough. People don't see it because they're focused on their task. So we have inattentional blindness happening here. So the artist iterated on it, changed the color, now it's blue because the tech in Fortnite is blue. It's bigger, it's pulsing inward, so that maybe it's gonna encourage people to aim at it. So it's bigger, like, all right, now that should solve the problem. So this is the play the session after this change. And yeah, players are still not aiming at it. But when I was asking them, what is this? Most players were replying something like, oh, this is the symbol telling me I'm targeting this element. So now they see it, but they don't perceive it the way we intended. So we need to go back to the drawing board to try to figure out how the hell we're gonna make sure they understand this. We could also have gone the way, hey, you know what, we're gonna just remove it and redo the system design without this thing. But designers, it's adding some game feel, so it's like now it's not just like mindlessly aiming a thing, you have to point where, so it's interesting to keep it, they wanted to keep it, but if we keep it, we need to solve this. And so what the designers did, they had a great idea for the story mode, because it's an RPG, you have a skill tree, so whenever you level up, you can buy new skills. And they removed the weak point from the beginning of the game and they put it in the skill tree. So now this is something you unlock at some point. So it looks like this. Players are like, well, of course people don't read. We always tag this with wishful thinking that people are going to read, but they don't. But that's why we have videos also. But there's a lot of steps that hopefully are going to make people pay attention to this. And now it becomes a reward that has a meaning and makes you more powerful in the game. And after we did that, we finally saw more people aiming at the thing. We didn't get 100% good, 100% hit with this. And we certainly did not solve for people who only play PvP. So a lot of people actually, they see that presentation like, oh, are you serious? Do I need to aim at that thing? So it's not solving for everything, but at least in the story mode, it was tremendously helping. And so this is what we're trying to do. We try to make a hypothesis and we try to figure out, and we spend a lot of time trying to fix it. That's a very tiny thing, and the whole scale of Fortnite, but it had a huge impact on the feeling of grindiness, because if people don't use it, of course it's going to take forever for them to gather the resources. So this is it. These are the ingredients that we use. There is no recipe for a successful game, but we do know some ingredients. And by having these ingredients, you can make up your own recipe for your game, depending on what experience you want to offer to what sort of players. So that's like a checklist, guidelines, so we can make sure that we're not forgetting what's something important to hit. And that's pretty much it. So I brought my book for those who want to browse it. Like I said, I'm pretty active on Twitter. I have a blog. There's resources on that blog. You go on the page called resources, you'll see a bunch of references. And if you're interested in the Game UX community, there's links there. And other than that, I'm going to stay if you have any questions. And thank you so much for your attention. Do you have questions? Yes.
So that room looks pretty big. How many people do you test at or with at one time?
How many tests do we do?
Like at Epic Games, you showed that like big picture of the
the pipeline
and stuff. Yeah, sorry, the pipeline. And all the TVs and stuff. So how many people will be testing the game at one time?
It depends. It really depends on the type of game we're making, if it's a multiplayer game or not, because if it's multiplayer, we need 2 teams playing against each other, so sometimes we can have 10 players playing like 5v5. Usually we try to have around 6 to 8 people. When we test for usability, it's enough, and also we test for engageability in the sense that we let them play and then we ask them questions about some things like, what is your objective right now? What are you aiming for? So we can see if are they projecting themselves towards something. Or we ask them stuff like, do you feel that you're getting more skillful in the game? So we ask them that they feel competent, or do you feel you have meaningful choices? So we ask very specific questions, and so usually around 6 or 8 people is enough to at least see the big problems. And then of course, all these hypotheses that we have, we're gonna verify with the big picture once we're in beta or alpha test. A lot of games do that now. Once they're nearly close to the end, they have beta testers, so you can sign up to participate in the test of the game. And so now we have thousands of people playing and we can see bigger trends, and we also send surveys, etc. So depending on where we're at in the development cycle, at the beginning we do very small tests. Sometimes it's just like a few people and we just prototypes, and then it's implemented, so it's a bigger test and blah blah blah, and at some point we test online.
So if you have multiple tests, do you bring back the same testers? Or do you try to have different people?
No, so if we're testing onboarding, it's going to be new players every time, because we need people who don't know anything about the game. But sometimes we're going to iterate on a system that is more advanced. Let's say we're going to iterate on the crafting system, but now we don't want to have players for hours until they're really comfortable with it to make them test a new system. So it happens sometimes we bring people back, and sometimes we have tests over several days because we test the engagement on medium term. So we need them to play like 20 hours of the game over several days, so that we can see how they're progressing in the game. So it really depends on what we're testing.
Gotcha.
Yes.
So, this is me, right?
Yes.
It was recently pointed out to me that Fortnite is still calling itself a beta. What's up?
I wondered about that as well.
Yeah. Yes. It's also a mindset. Live games, typically we call that games as a service. It's always evolving. So depending on the new features that we add, it's going to evolve. So it's always a beta in the sense that it's not. In the past, we were just making a game and we shipped it, and that was it. That was the game. Today, it's the game is always evolving, so it's never really done. So that's the reason why a lot of games just always are in beta forever.
So similar to like an operating system, you know, we have our iOS 12, 12.1, 12.2.
Exactly.
So it's continual iteration now.
Yeah, which is hard for the teams because now not only they're crunching, that's the nickname we give when you do overtime. It's cute. Before we were crunching towards the end, and then we're like, oh, we shipped. And now, when we ship, it's actually the beginning of the hard work. So there's a lot of people are really getting burned out because we have a culture of crunch, and with online games, it's getting very, very difficult.
Yes. So I'm familiar with some game user research, some setups, and they, from my perspective, you know, doing UX in the company, but not being part of the game design, they look really in-depth and complex and not very repeatable if you are somebody who wants to do it on a small scale. What would you recommend for doing that on a small scale that would yield at least somewhat meaningful insights?
In my career, I had to do a lot of very small tests with whatever means I had. It's doable. I would say that the most difficult part is actually to recruit the participants. because you absolutely have to have a sample of participants that is representative of your figure arts, which is complicated. If you're making Candy Crush, you're not gonna bring over people that play super hardcore games and vice versa. If you're making Dark Souls, you're not gonna bring over people who only play Candy Crush or Clash of Clans. So you have to make sure that you're bringing over people who are into that sort of games, and that's super time consuming. So that's the difficult part. Sometimes at LucasArts, for example, I was using a company to do the recruitment because they had a big database. When I started at Epic, immediately as soon as I started, I was like, we need to develop a database. I could not use it at the beginning, but after a year, I had enough people in the database, you know, like, sign up to participate in the playtest of whatever games you're playing, no matter how many times you play a week, we care about everybody. And then at some point we have enough people so we can get the right profiles. That's the hardest part. The rest, you can always try to put something together. Most of the thing, it's in my book, but most of the stuff, the tool that we're using at Epic and other companies, a lot of it is free. Like to record the session, we use OBS. It's Open Broadcasting System. It's a software that's used for Twitch streamers, for example. It's free, so you can use that. And you can have the overlay, there's a lot of plugins, so you can add the overlay of eye tracking using OBS, and the eye tracker that we were using is just like a $99 eye tracker. So it's not doing heat maps, but for games, heat maps are good when you have like a web page, like everybody's seeing the same thing, so you know what people are looking at. In a game, especially in a game that's not linear, not everybody's going to have the exact same visuals. So it's not as meaningful to have heat maps unless you want to verify how people are using the HUD. Just looking at where their gaze is can be enough. So you can use that, and so you need basically your device. You can have like another screen, so you can make sure that you're not right there, right behind there, because it's a bit like, come on, let me play. So it's really helpful to have another screen so you can see what they're doing like farther away. That's, if you have that, you can start doing playtests. And then you need to know how to not influence the test.
That's the hard part.
Yes, so among the blog posts I'm writing, I had like a guide for people who are not researchers to do their little test themselves, and being conscious of all the different biases. Not asking leading questions and not influencing people in one way or another. So I've been saying that for a year now, but hopefully I should be able to have some time to write on the upcoming days, so I can post all that.
Cool, I'll check it out.
Yeah.
Hi. This might be a little different, but I was wondering if you know how VR is or changing game UX or maybe enhancing game UX?
I mean, it's pretty much the same. It's just that the challenges are, the challenges are the same, but there's some things that are harder to solve in VR and things that are easier to solve in VR. The more screen estate, the more immersed people are. So if you're working on a game on a phone or AR, the big problem is actually distracting elements from outside the game. Like people play on their phones on the bus, you don't have their full attention. If it's on PC or on console, usually they're more into the game. In VR, they're fully immersed in the game. They can't really look. They can't look at them much within VR. So you're sure that they're gonna. You're not sure they're gonna pay attention to what's happening in the game, but you're sure they're not gonna be distracted unless, I don't know, their brothers and sisters are teasing them or whatever. But what's more challenging in VR are the signs and feedback, because you can't have a HUD in VR. You can't have a fixed overlay in VR, otherwise it's making people sick. So you need to have all the signs and feedback inside the environments, and most of the time it's going to be diegetic. So it's like the same thing as the characters seeing in the game. That's much harder, because if the sign is here and the player is looking here, So we have, it's the same principle, we have the same basic notions of attention perception, memory and motivation, emotion, all that. But there are things that are easier in terms of distractions that are out from outside the game, but things are harder in terms of perception, how you're going to draw, if there's a dialogue happening, we need to make sure that the player is actually looking at the thing, or if you want to, in terms of narration, it can be very, very difficult. So I worked on the bullet train, which is one of VR stuff that we're doing at Epic. For the onboarding part, we were in a corridor, so you were inside a train, so that you can't really go super far. So we solve these problems by constraining what the players can do. So we can ensure that they're going to see the things we need them to see. But it's challenging, but it's cool to work on that, because it's a different dimension. But the problems are the same. It's just the way we solve them, we have different constraints.
So I was wondering, if you guys are testing on a specific task, like that agent solution just now, so you was mentioned about you will bring 6 to 8 people. Will you kind of diversify like the user profile, maybe maybe like from different age group? How do you guys recruit?
Yeah, so I mostly care about their experience. The earlier we are in the development process, the more hardcore I need the players to be, because it can be, when you don't play a lot of these games, if you're not super expert, it can be very distracting to have place order elements and gray boxes and all that. So usually we start with more hardcore gamers, and as soon as we're here, it's all the polish is getting in there, we can broaden down the group that we're bringing over. We try to have diverse people, because diversity is super important, like anything that we produce. So we're gonna have to make sure that we're gonna bring over gamers with disabilities, and we're gonna bring over men, women, and like different profiles. So we're covering all of the grounds. What we care about is people who are interested in the sort of game that we're making. That's the most important thing. What age they have, what gender they are, doesn't matter. But it matters that we bring them over, like a lot of different people, so that we are accounting for the blind spots that we have. Because if you're a white man, you cannot account for other people. If you don't have any disability, then you can't account for people having a disability. So we have blind spots, we have biases, most of them are unconscious. That's the reason why diversity is really important when you build a product, because of these blind spots. So also when you test, you make sure that you have a diverse pool of participants to make sure that we find all the issues coming from all the different people. Yes?
Fortnite is a uniquely successful game, and I know that it's been developed like as far back as 2014.
2011.
2011, yeah, and you joined as like a formal UX person essentially around that time. Like, was 2011 kind of around that time game companies were formalizing the UX discipline, or do you think Epic was uniquely progressive around that time?
No, I mean the ones who started this, I would say, was Microsoft. They're one of the first to have a big lab, and Microsoft, as soon as they started to make games, they applied the UX research to games. Ubisoft was very much into it. Quite early, they had playtests. So playtesting started maybe around, in the game industry, around maybe, I want to say 2005 or 6, something like that. But then it was not formalized as part of the UX strategy. UX strategy was, the term UX was not used. So they were playtesting, but most of the time it was not part of the pipeline that I showed you. It was not, there was no hypothesis, there was no formalization of the brain limitations and why this is important and blah, blah, blah.
I guess like that specific kind of UX. Or
That, became bigger once games became games as a service and free to play. Because that became, it's not that it was not important before, but you could get away with it more easily. Now that a lot of games are online, it's exploded the competition, and you don't have a lot of time to convince players to play your game. And the thing that a lot of people are not necessarily aware of is that making games is pretty hard. It's a pretty harsh industry. There's a lot of games that are game canned, or they are launched and then they immediately are not working, and people are fired, and sometimes studios are closing. Even big studios, like the studio was making the game Walking Dead, so a big franchise, died. So it's a pretty harsh industry. So that's the reason why you don't have a lot of room for failure in there. So that make UX like super critical. Yep.
Can you talk about more of the metrics on when you're trying to determine like how the game is like meaningful to the gamer, or like are you measuring like the intrinsic and extrinsic motivations, and like how are you determining that? Because it's all subjective. It's kind of like qualitative. Are you like mapping it on an axis or what?
It's good enough research, because I mean I'm talking about the scientific method, but of course we're not a real lab, and we're not in academia. In academia, you're gonna spend a lot of time to make sure that what you're observing is actually a real impact. In games, we need the results by yesterday, and so everything is super fast. So we try to make it good enough so we're not like completely out of the blue, but it's not as rigorous as it could be. And so trying to get back to what I was trying to say.
So you probably don't go as granular as like trying to figure out like a player archetype and then trying to like cater that specific archetype.
No, we don't have the time for that. Sometimes we try to figure out some stuff, are people who like to build, or do they do other stuff? And we try to figure out what are people doing with the games. Are they different sort of profiles that are coming out of it, and can we make sure that everybody is having fun? But we would ask questions, we are going to ask questions through surveys, through behavior and through surveys. If people understand what they're going to get, what's their next objective. For example, in Fortnite, a lot of people, when we're playtesting, were saying, oh, I still want to have the ninja, but then they don't necessarily were able to see where the ninja is getting unlocked in the skill tree because it was not clear. So oftentimes, in the design, it's there, like there's clear milestones and motivation and goals and rewards associated to these goals are in the design, but it's not expressed clearly enough for players. So we verify that sort of thing. For intrinsic motivation, like I said earlier, we ask specific questions about, did you feel you had meaningful choices? Did you feel that when you played with someone it was easier, or did you feel that you were impacting meaningfully other players, or that players were meaningful to you, that did they help you? Questions like this are going to be important for relatedness, for cooperation. So depending on what sort of game you're making, we're going to ask specific questions to cover the motivation, like intrinsic and extrinsic, so we can see, and we use a Likert scale. So we're going to use, say, I felt I was progressing in the game. Completely disagree, completely agree.
So Likert scale?
Yeah, that's what we use. Yes?
I forgot my question.
Sorry.
Oh, no, I remember. So you're only testing on like 6 to 8 people, and then you have like probably, I don't know, hundreds of thousands of players. Do you ever test something and then you put it out there and realize that your test was wrong, or?
No, because yes and no. We're going to make assumptions, and sometimes we believe something is a bigger problem than it is in reality, and vice versa. Sometimes we think that, oh, it's not going to be a big deal, and then it's actually a big deal. But we do account for that, and we know that we are waiting for the beta test to verify in a bigger population. Mm-hmm. So it's not that we are prepared that if this is happening, then we can fix it. But in the playtest, we can make sure that in the playtest we don't ask questions like, was it fun, or Did you find that intuitive, or did you understand what you had to do? We actually asked them the questions like, what was the objective here? What was the point of doing this? How do you do this in the game? What is this? What is that? So we asked very objective questions that if even among 8 people, there's 1 or 2 people that are not sure, it's a big flag, especially if it's affecting a big component of the game, like one of the main pillars of the game, like building or crafting, then like we have a good idea that it can be a big problem.
And then how do you measure out in the field? What kinds of things are you?
So telemetry. So we need to put hooks in the game. And to put hooks in the game, we're actually using a hypothesis and the test that we did, so we know what we need to measure. So for example, in Fortnite, if you need to know how to build to be competent, we're gonna make sure that we have hooks where if players are or not using to edit a door or a window in Fortnite. Because if you don't know how to do that, it's going to be very hard for you to win in Fortnite. So we know ahead of time what is it we're going to measure, so we put specific hooks in there.
Okay.
There's a big caveat with big data. People, I love data, they're like, oh, data. And they have a tendency to put hooks in everything, and they gather all the data. But the problem is that people don't understand that data is not information. So having data is cool, but you can have flawed data or not really useful data, and it's taking a lot of effort to put all the hooks in there. So it's better to ahead of time again have an hypothesis. So you put the hooks that are going to be useful for you, and you anticipate once you have the results, what are you going to do with this? What sort of decisions you're going to make the game better? So that's helping into defining what metrics we're going to care about.
So one last, I think we have time for one more question.
Okay.
So is there any UX research that you do prior to a game being built, or is the overall process more evaluative?
We do a lot of different testing at all steps. Even in conception, we sometimes, if we do a game and we know there's a building component, we're gonna look into a competitive, one of the game in our competition, and we might bring people over and we watch them play that game for the first time. So we can anticipate what sort of problems this game had to solve, and can we solve it better, so we can anticipate problems. So yeah, there's always something you can test. And you can test systems with just dice and cards. For example, you pretend, oh, when you level up, you can get this, and throw dice, and you can see if you get it or not, blah, blah, blah. So we can simulate progression, so we can test things like that. Cool. So we do some paper tests.
Okay. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. I think that we need to wrap up. Again, she has offered, if you have additional questions, to contact her over Twitter.
Yeah, Twitter or LinkedIn. That's really my social platforms of choice.
And I highly recommend the book. It's a really good book to go in more depth of what she's talking about. So I'm not getting any...
You can take a look if you
Feel free to take some food.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, you're welcome.
It's getting quite warm in here.
I know. I was feeling the same way.
And if you guys can please help throw your trash away, that'd be great.
Yeah. And then, do you know where all the chairs and stuff go?
Yeah, the chairs are pretty much here. We fold up the chairs. Yeah.
I will go start